The trading post existed in a state of deliberate ambiguity. Located on the neutral meridian of Haldron Station, a massive cylindrical habitat that spun lazily between the territorial claims of 6 different species, the establishment served as a meeting ground for those who preferred their business conducted far from official oversight. The walls were lined with sound-dampening foam that had gone yellow with age and absorbed decades of conversations that were better left unrecorded. Lighting came from strips of bioluminescent algae growing in transparent tubes, casting everything in a sickly green glow that made it impossible to tell if someone was pale from fear or simply suffering from the station's notoriously unreliable vitamin synthesizers. The air smelled of ozone and recycled breath, with an underlying note of something organic that the filtration system had never quite managed to eliminate. Behind a counter constructed from what appeared to be salvaged cargo containers, a Threxian merchant named Zelak sorted through a collection of data chips with 4 of his 6 hands, while the remaining 2 prepared a pot of fermented grain beverage that his clientele had learned to tolerate, if not enjoy. Threxians were insectoid in appearance, with chitinous exoskeletons that ranged from deep purple to almost black, compound eyes that could perceive a spectrum humans found nauseating, and a nervous system so distributed throughout their bodies that they could continue working even after losing entire limbs. Zelak had owned the trading post for 23 standard years, having inherited it from a previous operator who had disappeared under circumstances that everyone agreed were best left unexamined. In that time, Zelak had developed an instinct for reading situations. He could sense when a negotiation was about to turn violent, could identify undercover security personnel by the way they held their drinks, could tell the difference between a legitimate cargo hauler and a smuggler by nothing more than how they walked through his door. Tonight, that instinct was screaming that something unusual was about to unfold. The source of his unease sat at a corner table, methodically working through a bowl of protein paste that the station's synthesizers claimed was nutritionally equivalent to Terran food, though the flavor suggested otherwise. The human was ancient by the standards of his species, easily past 80 standard years, with skin that resembled crumpled parchment and hands that trembled slightly as they guided the spoon from bowl to mouth. He wore clothing that had been practical once, gray work pants, a faded olive shirt, and over it all a brown canvas jacket with patches sewn over patches. On his right shoulder sat a faded insignia that Zelak didn't recognize, though something about the stylized symbol of crossed lines and a circle made his antenna twitch with unease. The old human had arrived 3 hours ago, paid for his meal in advance with currency so old that Zelak had to verify its authenticity through his historical database, and had been sitting there ever since, eating slowly and watching the room with eyes that seemed somehow out of place in his weathered face. They were sharp, those eyes, a pale blue that reminded Zelak of ice formations on high-gravity worlds, and they tracked movement with a precision that suggested military training, even if that training had occurred long before most of the station's current inhabitants were born. The trouble arrived in the form of 6 Krovar mercenaries. The Krovar were one of the younger spacefaring species, having achieved faster-than-light travel only 60 years ago through a combination of reverse-engineered alien technology and their own considerable aptitude for engineering. They were bipedal, roughly humanoid in structure, but with broader shoulders and longer arms that gave them a distinctive hunched appearance. Their skin was covered in fine scales that shifted color based on their emotional state, ranging from cool blues when calm to angry reds when agitated. They had no hair, but instead possessed a series of bony ridges that ran from their foreheads to the base of their skulls, patterns unique to each individual like fingerprints. These particular Krovar were clearly soldiers rather than merchants. They wore matching tactical harnesses over civilian clothes, a common practice for mercenaries who wanted to appear non-threatening while still having quick access to weapons. Their leader was a female named Kisra, and her scales were currently displaying the confident purple-red of someone who had recently completed a successful mission and was looking for ways to celebrate. The 4 males behind her moved with the synchronized efficiency of a unit that had worked together for years, their eyes scanning the trading post for threats with the automatic thoroughness of professionals. They had just finished a protection contract on the Outer Rim, guarding a convoy of medical supplies through a sector where pirates had been particularly active. The job had gone smoothly, no casualties, no losses, and the bonus they'd received for early completion was burning holes in their accounts. Now they wanted to drink, to boast, to remind everyone in the vicinity that they were dangerous and successful, and not to be trifled with. Kisra's eyes locked onto the corner table where the old human sat. It was the best position in the room, offering clear sight lines to both entrances and solid walls on 2 sides. It was exactly where she wanted to be, where someone of her status deserved to be. The fact that it was occupied by what appeared to be a decrepit Terran who could barely hold his spoon steady only made the situation more irritating. She approached the table with her squad arrayed behind her in a loose formation that managed to be both casual and vaguely threatening. The old human continued eating, his attention apparently focused entirely on the unappetizing contents of his bowl. "Elder," Kisra said, her translator chip rendering her words in flat, unaccented galactic standard. "You occupy valuable space." The old human paused, his spoon halfway to his mouth, and set it down carefully. He looked up at Kisra with those ice-blue eyes, and for just a moment, she felt something cold touch the base of her spine. Then the moment passed, and she was looking at nothing more threatening than a geriatric human who probably needed assistance getting out of bed in the morning. "I paid for my meal," he said, his voice like dry leaves scraping across metal. "When I finish eating, I'll leave." One of the males behind Kisra, a young soldier named Vex, whose scales still showed the bright patterns of inexperience, let out a derisive hiss. "Listen to this one. Acts like he owns the place. Probably hasn't thrown a punch in 50 years. 63, the old human said mildly, returning his attention to his bowl. "Give or take." Kisra felt her scales shift toward orange, the Krovar equivalent of annoyance. She wasn't used to being dismissed, especially not by something as fragile as a human. Humans were soft, everyone knew that. Their bones broke easily, their skin tore like paper, and they died from injuries that most species would shrug off as inconvenient. The fact that they had managed to become a spacefaring civilization was attributed more to stubbornness than any particular physical advantage. "We are not making a request," Kisra said, her voice dropping to what she imagined was an intimidating growl. "We are informing you of a change in circumstances. This table is now ours. You may relocate to another position, or you may leave the establishment entirely. Choose quickly." The old human continued eating. His hands, Kisra noticed with irritation, were no longer trembling. They moved with absolute steadiness as they guided the spoon through the thick protein paste, as if her presence and threats were no more concerning than a change in the artificial lighting. "How about this?" the old human said without looking up. "You and your friends go find another table. There are at least 4 empty ones. I'll finish my meal, which I've already paid for, and then we can all go about our business without anyone doing something they'll regret." Vex stepped forward, his scales flushing bright red with indignation. "Regret? You think we'll regret moving one old human? You think your species still has the power to threaten anyone? The war was generations ago, Elder. Your people's reputation died with your soldiers." "Vex," Kisra said sharply, holding up a hand. Something about the situation was beginning to feel wrong, like the moment before a reactor malfunction when all the indicators still read normal, but some primal instinct screams that disaster is imminent. But Vex was young and angry and eager to prove himself. He reached down and grabbed the edge of the old human's bowl, yanking it away so hard that protein paste splashed across the table. "I'm talking to you, Fossil. When a Krovar warrior tells you to move, you..." The old human's hand moved. It wasn't fast in the way that combat footage is fast, all blur and violence. It was something else, something that Zilak watching from behind his counter recognized with growing horror. It was economical, each motion flowing into the next with the kind of efficiency that came from performing the same movements thousands of times until they became as natural as breathing. The old human's hand caught Vex's wrist, twisted, and suddenly the young Krovar was bent forward over the table, his arm locked at an angle that made his scales flush white with pain. The protein paste bowl was back in front of the old human, barely disturbed. The entire motion had taken perhaps 2 seconds. "Son," the old human said, his voice still mild, still almost gentle. "You're making a mistake. I understand you're young and full of yourself, and probably very good at whatever it is you do. But right now, you need to take a breath, step back, and think very carefully about your next move." Vex tried to pull away, but the old human's grip was unyielding. The ancient hand that had been trembling minutes ago now held the young warrior immobile, with seemingly no effort at all. Vex's scales cycled through colors rapidly, a Krovar physiological response to extreme stress that he couldn't control. Kisra's own scales went dark blue, the color of tactical assessment. She'd seen enough combat to recognize real danger when it presented itself, and everything about this situation was suddenly screaming warnings that she'd been too arrogant to hear earlier. The trembling hands hadn't been age, she realized. They'd been discipline, the conscious effort of someone who was so used to moving in precise, lethal ways that appearing harmless required constant concentration. "Release him," Kisra said, her voice carefully neutral. "We'll find another table." "Good choice," the old human said, and let go of Vex's wrist. The young Krovar stumbled backward, cradling his arm, his scales a mottled combination of pain white and shame gray. But Vex's pride was wounded worse than his wrist. He looked at Kisra, at his squadmates, and saw the doubt in their eyes. Saw them questioning whether he was ready, whether he was strong enough, whether he belonged. And that doubt, that perceived weakness in their regard, was more than he could tolerate. His hand went to his hip, to the concealed holster where regulations said civilians weren't supposed to carry weapons, but everyone did anyway. 3 things happened simultaneously. The old human's bowl hit the floor, shattering with a sound like breaking glass. Zelak dropped behind his counter with a speed that seemed impossible for someone with 6 limbs. And Kisra shouted, "No!" in a voice that made every other patron in the trading post freeze. Vex had his weapon halfway drawn when the old human moved again. This time there was no economy of motion, no gentle instruction. The human was across the distance between them faster than Kisra's combat-trained eyes could track, and Vex was on the floor with his weapon gone, and his arm bent at an angle that made several of the watching patrons wince in sympathetic pain. The old human stood over him, breathing normally, not even winded. In his hand was Vex's weapon, and he was checking it with the automatic efficiency of someone who had handled thousands of similar devices. He ejected the power cell, cleared the chamber, and set both pieces on a nearby table with a gentle care that was somehow more terrifying than any display of violence. "Don't," the old human said, and his voice had changed. It was no longer mild, no longer gentle. It was the voice of someone who had given orders in places where orders meant the difference between living and dying. Don't ever draw on someone unless you're prepared to use it, and don't ever use it unless you're prepared to live with what happens next. He looked up at Kisra, and his eyes were still ice blue, still sharp, but now there was something else in them. Not anger, not satisfaction, just a vast, tired sadness. "Get your soldier medical attention. That arm's going to need treatment, but nothing's broken. He'll be fine in a few days. And maybe he'll be smarter." Kisra nodded jerkily. 2 of her squad moved forward to help Vex to his feet, while the 3rd kept his hands very carefully visible and away from any weapons. They had all trained for years, had survived dozens of combat situations, had built reputations as skilled mercenaries, and they had just watched an elderly human disable one of their own with less effort than it took to brew tea. "Who are you?" Kisra asked, and her voice came out smaller than she intended. The old human turned away, looking down at his shattered bowl and the protein paste spreading across the floor. "Nobody important, just someone who wanted to finish his meal in peace." "That's not an answer. It's the only answer you're going to get." He looked at Zelak, who was slowly emerging from behind his counter, antenna twitching frantically. "Sorry about the mess. I'll pay for the damage." Zelak waved all 6 hands in a gesture that combined dismissal with something that looked uncomfortably close to panic. "No charge, honored one. No charge at all. Please sit. I'll bring you another bowl." "That's not necessary." But Zelak was already scurrying into his back room, moving with the kind of speed that suggested he was actively trying to get away from the situation. The door hissed shut behind him, and from inside came the sound of frantic communication on a private channel. Kisra helped her squad get Vex toward the exit. The young warrior was conscious but pale, his scales fading to the dull gray of shock. At the doorway, she paused and looked back at the old human, who had seated himself again and was examining the pieces of his broken bowl with what appeared to be genuine regret. "We'll find out who you are," she said. "We have contacts, resources. If you're someone important, someone dangerous, we need to know." The old human didn't look up. "You're young, so I'll give you some advice. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is not ask questions. Not because you're afraid of the answers, but because once you know something, you can't unknow it. And knowledge has a weight all its own." They left. The trading post was silent except for the hum of the life support systems and the gentle gurgle of the algae tubes. The other patrons, a mixture of species and professions, all carefully avoided looking at the old human. Some paid their tabs and departed with more speed than their entrance had suggested. Others suddenly found their drinks fascinating, studying the contents with intense concentration. The old human sat at his table, alone now, and waited. Zelak emerged from the back room 5 minutes later, carrying a fresh bowl of protein paste and moving with the careful precision of someone approaching a live explosive. He set the bowl down gently, and his translator chip rendered his clicks and hisses into galactic standard. "I have contacted Security Chief Varlon," Zelak said, his antennae drooping in what might have been apology or submission. "She is coming. I had to report the incident. It's regulations, you understand? I understand, the old human said. You're just doing your job. Don't worry about it. You are not, Zelak hesitated, trying to find the right words. You are not what you appear to be. None of us are, friend. We're all just trying to get by. That marking on your shoulder. I ran it through my database. It is very old, from the early expansion era. But the database has no details, only a note that records regarding that particular insignia are sealed under military classification protocols. Sealed by Terran Naval Command with the highest possible encryption. The old human took a bite of his fresh protein paste and made a face. This stuff really is terrible. How do you eat it? Please, Zelak said, and there was something almost pleading in his translated voice. If you are someone important, someone dangerous, I need to know. This is my establishment. I have worked very hard to keep it neutral territory, to make sure that all species feel safe conducting their business here. If there is going to be trouble, there won't be trouble, the old human interrupted gently. I promise you that. Whatever happens next, your trading post will be fine. You've done nothing wrong, and no one's going to blame you for anything. The door hissed open. Security Chief Varlon entered with 4 of her enforcement officers. Varlon was Keldon, a species that had evolved on a high-gravity world and whose bodies reflected that harsh origin. She stood nearly 3 meters tall, with skin that looked like polished obsidian, and muscles that seemed to be made of braided steel cables. Her face was brutal in its efficiency, all sharp angles and hard planes, with eyes that glowed a soft amber in the dim light. She wore the dark blue uniform of station security, modified to accommodate her proportions, and the weapons on her belt were sized for someone who could crush human skulls with her bare hands. She had been security chief of Haldron Station for 8 years. In that time, she had broken up 3 attempted coups, prevented 2 acts of terrorism, and maintained order among a population that included representatives from 14 different species, many of whom had historical grievances with each other. She was competent, thorough, and not easily impressed. The sight of the old human sitting calmly at his table eating protein paste made her stop dead in her tracks. Her officers spread out behind her in a standard security formation, hands resting on their sidearms but not drawing them. They were trained professionals, and they could read Varlon's body language well enough to know that something about this situation was making their chief very, very careful. You, Varlon said, her voice a deep rumble that vibrated through the floor. State your identification. The old human set down his spoon and looked up at her. Good evening, Chief. Beautiful station you're running here. Very well maintained. I did not ask for compliments. I asked for identification. William Carver, the old human said. Retired. Independent contractor doing some consulting work for a mining operation in the asteroid belt. Stopped here for supplies and a meal before heading back to Terran space. Varlon's amber eyes narrowed. You disabled a Krovar warrior. Witnesses say the entire confrontation lasted less than 10 seconds. He drew a weapon on me. I responded appropriately. No permanent damage done, and I didn't file charges. As far as I'm concerned, the matter's resolved. As far as you're concerned, Varlon moved closer, her massive frame making the furniture in the trading post look like children's toys. I have been chief of security on this station for 8 years. In that time I have seen hundreds of fights, dozens of attempted murders, and more displays of violence than I care to count. I have never, not once, seen someone move the way witnesses claim you moved. Witnesses exaggerate. It's human nature. Well, human and most other species' nature. The fight was over quickly because I had surprise on my side, and the young warrior was inexperienced. I ran your identification through the system. Varlon continued as if he hadn't spoken. William Carver, Terran citizen, born 84 standard years ago on Earth. Employment history shows 40 years working in various mining operations throughout the outer systems. No criminal record, no military service on file, no reason for anyone to give you a second look. Sounds about right. Except, Varlon said, and her voice dropped even lower. When I ran your biometric signature through our security scanners, the system flagged you. Not for criminal activity. For something else. The flag has no details attached, just a priority code and instructions to contact Terran Naval Command immediately. The old human was silent for a moment. Then he sighed, a sound of infinite weariness. Well, that's unfortunate. Unfortunate, Varlon repeated. That is your response? You are not going to tell me that it is a mistake, that there is some error in the system? Would you believe me if I did? No. Then there's no point in lying about it, is there? The old human pushed his bowl away, apparently having lost his appetite. You've done your job, Chief. You've identified a flagged individual and followed protocol. Now we wait for someone from Naval Command to arrive and sort this out. You are not under arrest, Varlon said carefully. The flag in the system does not indicate you are wanted for any crime. It simply requires that your presence be reported. However, if you attempt to leave the station before this matter is resolved, that will change. Understood. I'll stay put. You are remarkably calm about this situation. The old human smiled, and it was not a happy expression. Chief, I've lived a long time and seen a lot of things. Getting worked up about circumstances I can't control stopped being useful decades ago. Your officers will do whatever they're going to do. Naval Command will send whoever they're going to send, and I'll deal with whatever happens next. Everything else is just wasted energy. Varlon studied him for a long moment, her amber eyes searching for something she couldn't quite identify. Finally, she nodded. You may remain here or return to your quarters, but you will not leave the station. My officers will be monitoring all departure bays. Am I clear? Crystal, she turned to leave, then paused. Out of curiosity, are you actually a mining consultant? Sometimes, the old human said. When the work's available and I need the credits, it's not glamorous, but it's honest. And the rest of the time? The rest of the time I'm just an old man trying to stay out of everyone's way. Varlon left with her officers, and the trading post slowly began to return to normal. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, drinks were ordered, and the business of neutral ground commerce continued its eternal cycle. But everyone in the establishment kept sneaking glances at the old human, wondering who he really was, what he'd done, and whether they should be worried about his presence. The old human sat at his table and waited. 2 hours later, a woman entered the trading post. She was human, perhaps 50 standard years old, with steel gray hair cut short in a military style, and a face that looked like it had been assembled from straight lines and right angles. She wore a dark suit rather than a uniform, but everything about her posture and bearing screamed military officer. Her eyes swept the room once, identified the old human immediately, and locked onto him with an intensity that made Zilak's antennae flatten against his skull. She walked to the corner table and stood there, saying nothing. The old human looked up at her, and something in his expression softened, just slightly. Hello, Catherine, he said quietly. Sir, she responded, and her voice cracked just slightly on the single syllable. It's just William now, has been for a long time. You don't need to call me sir. With all due respect, I will always call you sir. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down with the precise movements of someone who had spent decades following protocol. We've been looking for you for 3 years. I know. You know. That's it. You know. Catherine, I'm 84 years old. I'm tired. I wanted some time to myself, to go places where nobody knew who I was or what I'd done. I thought I'd earned that. You did earn it. You earned it 100 times over. But sir, you can't just disappear. Not someone like you. There are protocols, procedures, security considerations. I don't care about protocols anymore, the old human said, and there was steel underneath the weariness in his voice. I followed protocols for 60 years. I did everything asked of me, everything required, and then some. When I decided I was done, I left. Quietly, without fuss, without asking permission. And I've been living a quiet life ever since, bothering nobody, causing no trouble. Catherine's jaw tightened. Except for tonight, when you put a Krovar mercenary on the floor hard enough to require medical attention. He drew on me. What was I supposed to do, let him shoot me? You could have identified yourself. Told them who you were. They would have backed down immediately. And if I'd done that, you'd be here anyway, having this same conversation. At least this way I got to finish most of my meal first. Catherine laughed despite herself, a short, sharp sound that surprised both of them. I forgot how stubborn you are. Not stubborn, just old and set in my ways. He leaned back in his chair, and for the first time that evening, he looked his age. How many people know I'm here? Currently? Just me and the security chief. But I had to file a report when your biometric signature was flagged, which means it's in the system. It won't take long for others to notice. Maybe a day, maybe a week, but someone will see it. And then everyone will know that William Carver, the ghost of Kepler Station, the man who single-handedly turned the tide of the Quentara Rebellion, is alive and sitting in a trading post eating terrible protein paste. The old human winced. I really hate that name. I told everyone I hated that name. Names stick, sir, especially when they're earned. They sat in silence for a moment. Around them, the trading post continued its business, but Zilak kept glancing at the corner table with his compound eyes, his antennae twitching with nervous energy. "Catherine," the old human said finally, "I can't come back. Whatever you're here to ask, whatever orders you're carrying, the answer is no. I'm done. I've been done for 3 years, and I intend to stay done." "I'm not here to bring you back," Catherine said softly. "I'm here to warn you." That got his attention. His ice-blue eyes sharpened, and suddenly he was focused on her with an intensity that made her remember why she'd followed him into hell more times than she could count. "Warn me about what?" "The Quintara remnants. They've been quiet for years, but our intelligence suggests they're reorganizing. And they've put out word through their networks that they're looking for you. Not William Carver, the mining consultant. You, the ghost. The one who dismantled their entire command structure in a single night. That was 20 years ago. They should have moved on by now. They don't move on. Their culture doesn't allow it. You ended their rebellion, killed their leaders, destroyed everything they'd built. In their eyes, the debt can only be settled one way." The old human was quiet for a long time. "So what do you expect me to do? Go into hiding deeper than I already am? Start moving every few weeks, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots? I'm too old for that life, Catherine. I know. Which is why I'm offering you protection. Come back to Terran space. Accept a security detail. Let us keep you safe." "Absolutely not. Sir, no." The word was flat, final. "I will not spend the rest of my life surrounded by guards, living in some secure compound, being watched and monitored every moment. If the Quintara want to come for me, let them come. I'm an old man. I'm not worth the resources you'd expend keeping me alive." "You're worth every resource we have," Catherine said fiercely. "You saved thousands of lives. You prevented a war that would have destabilized an entire sector. You're a hero, whether you want to admit it or not." "I'm a killer," the old human said quietly. "A very efficient one. I did what needed to be done, yes, but that doesn't make me a hero. It makes me someone who was good at violence when violence was necessary. That's not something to celebrate. It's something to protect." "Catherine," he reached across the table and placed his weathered hand over hers. "I appreciate what you're trying to do. I really do. But my answer is no. I'll take my chances with the Quintara. Maybe they'll find me. Maybe they won't. Either way, it's my choice to make." Catherine looked down at his hand on hers and felt something inside her crack. This man had trained her, mentored her, saved her life more times than she could count. He'd been her commander, her teacher, her example of what it meant to be a soldier. And now he was asking her to walk away and let him face his death alone. "I can't do that, sir," she said, and her voice was barely above a whisper. "I can't just leave you here knowing what's coming. You can, and you will. Because I'm ordering you to. Last time, I promise. The last order I'll ever give. Take your report back to command. Tell them you found me. Tell them I refused protection. And then let me live what's left of my life in peace." She pulled her hand away and stood up. For a moment she looked down at him, this old man who'd once been the most dangerous human alive, who'd faced impossible odds and impossible choices, and somehow managed to remain human through it all. Then she came to attention and saluted, sharp and precise, the way she'd been taught all those years ago. "Sir, it's been an honor." He returned the salute, and his hand was absolutely steady. "The honor was mine, Captain. You became everything I hoped you would. More, actually. Be proud of that." She turned and left without another word, because if she stayed any longer, she was going to say something that would make this even harder than it already was. The trading post door hissed shut behind her, and she was gone. The old human sat alone at his table, staring at his half-finished bowl of protein paste. Around him, the trading post slowly emptied as patrons finished their business and departed into the maze of corridors that formed Haldron Station. Zilak approached cautiously, all 6 hands wringing together in a gesture of nervousness. "Honored one," Zilak said. "I close soon. Will you be staying longer?" "No. I should get back to my quarters. Thank you for the meal, Zilak. Even if it did taste terrible. It is not meant to be enjoyed, only to sustain, but you are welcome regardless." Zilak hesitated. "The woman who was just here, she seemed concerned for you. She's a good officer. Good people. They all are, in their way. And the warning she brought, about those who seek you?" The old human stood slowly, his joints protesting the movement. "Everyone dies eventually, friend. The method is less important than what you do with the time you have. I've had a good run, all things considered. If it ends here, on this station, so be it. He paid his tab and left, walking through the corridors with the slightly shuffling gait of someone whose knees had logged too many kilometers. Other travelers moved around him, going about their business, none of them aware that they'd just passed someone who'd once been a legend. 3 days passed quietly. The old human went about his business, checking on supply deliveries for his supposed mining operation, reviewing technical specifications, doing all the mundane work of someone who was exactly what he appeared to be. Security Chief Varlan's officers kept a discreet distance, monitoring but not interfering. On the 4th day, they came. There were 8 of them, Quintara warriors wearing civilian clothes that didn't quite disguise the weapons underneath. They entered the station through different docking bays, filtered through customs one at a time, and gathered in a storage section on the lower decks. Their leader was a male named Skreth, and the ritual scars on his face indicated he had sworn a blood oath that could only be fulfilled through the death of his target. They had been tracking William Carver, the Ghost, for 3 years. They had followed rumors and whispers, had bribed informants and hacked databases, had slowly pieced together the pattern of his movements. When his biometric signature appeared in Haldron Station's systems, they'd moved immediately, converging on the location with the single-minded focus of predators who'd finally found their prey. The Quintara were formidable warriors. Their species had evolved as ambush hunters on a world where stealth meant survival, and their natural abilities had only been enhanced by centuries of martial tradition. They could move in complete silence, could remain motionless for hours, could strike from shadows with lethal precision. During the rebellion, they had been responsible for dozens of assassinations, hundreds of casualties, and the destabilization of 3 entire planetary governments. They were very good at what they did. But the man they were hunting was better. The old human knew they were coming before they even entered the station. It was a sense developed over decades of operating in hostile territory. An awareness of pattern disruption that some people called intuition, but was really just the result of seeing the same situations play out hundreds of times. When he reviewed the passenger manifests from the last 4 days, and saw 8 Quintara arriving separately, but within hours of each other, all booking short-term stays, all paying in cash, he knew exactly what it meant. He made his preparations calmly, methodically, with the muscle memory of someone who'd done this so many times it was like a comfortable routine. He notified Security Chief Varlan through a secure channel, giving her a heads up about what was likely to happen. He arranged for his few possessions to be shipped to an address on Earth if he didn't survive the next 12 hours. He wrote a brief message to Catherine, thanking her for her concern and apologizing for being stubborn. And then he went to wait. He chose a maintenance corridor on the outer ring, a section that was nominally public space but rarely traveled. It offered multiple sight lines, limited entry points, and several emergency bulkheads that could be sealed remotely. It was, in other words, ideal defensive terrain for someone who knew how to use it. The Quintara found him exactly where he'd planned for them to find him. Skreth led his warriors into the corridor with confidence, certain that their prey was trapped, that the old man who destroyed their rebellion would finally face justice. They moved in perfect tactical formation, covering all angles, weapons ready. They found the old human sitting on a maintenance crate, his hands visible and empty, his posture relaxed. He looked up as they approached, and if he felt any fear, it didn't show on his weathered face. "Gentlemen," he said calmly, "I was wondering when you'd arrive. You're very good at staying hidden. It took me longer than I expected to figure out you were here." Skreth stepped forward, his weapon aimed at the old human's center mass. "William Carver, the Ghost of Kepler Station. 20 years we have waited for this moment. 20 years of tracking you, searching for you, following every whisper of your presence. You destroyed everything we built, killed our leaders, shattered our cause. Now you will answer for those crimes." "I will," the old human agreed. "But before we do this, I need you to understand something. In about 3 minutes, Security Chief Varlan is going to seal this section. These corridors will be locked down, no one in or out, and she'll flood them with a fast-acting sedative gas that will put all of you to sleep. When you wake up, you'll be in custody, and this whole thing will be over without anyone dying." Skreth's eyes narrowed. "You think we will simply surrender? That we will allow ourselves to be captured like common criminals? I think you have a choice. You can leave now, walk away, and I promise you won't be pursued. Or you can stay, try to kill me, and spend the rest of your lives in a detention facility. Those are your options." One of the other warriors, a younger male whose scars were still fresh, let out a hiss of contempt. "The ghost begs for mercy. The legend is pathetic." "Not begging," the old human said quietly. Warning, there's a difference. He looked at Skreth directly. You swore a blood oath. I understand that. Your culture demands it, and I respect that, even if I don't agree with it. But your oath is about justice, not about throwing your lives away on something pointless. You think killing me will restore what I destroyed. It won't. It'll just add one more body to a pile that's already too high. You dare lecture us about honor? You, who move through our territory like a demon, killing without mercy, without hesitation. You destroyed more than our leaders, Ghost. You destroyed our people's faith in themselves, our belief that we could stand against oppression and injustice. How many of us died because of you? How many families were shattered? The old human was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with something that might have been regret. More than I can count. More than I want to remember. I did what I was ordered to do, and I was very good at it. But that doesn't mean I'm proud of it. If there was a way to undo what happened, to bring back the people who died, I would take it. But there isn't. All we can do is decide what happens next. What happens next, Skreth said, his voice cold, is that you die. The old human nodded, as if he'd expected this response. All right then. Last chance. Anyone who wants to leave, now's the time. I won't stop you, and neither will station security. You have my word on that. None of the Quentara moved. They'd come too far, waited too long, sworn oaths that bound them more thoroughly than any chains. To walk away now would be worse than death. So be it, the old human said, and stood up from his crate. What happened next would later be described by Security Chief Varlin as the most perfectly executed defensive engagement I have witnessed in my 30 years of law enforcement. The maintenance corridor cameras captured every moment, and the footage would be studied by military tacticians for years to come. The old human moved with a speed and precision that seemed impossible for someone his age. But it wasn't the speed that made the difference. It was the economy of motion, the perfect understanding of angles and timing, the way he used the environment itself as a weapon. He triggered emergency bulkheads at exactly the right moments, separating the Quentara warriors, forcing them to engage him one or two at a time, instead of as a group. He used maintenance equipment as improvised weapons, turning ordinary tools into instruments of non-lethal incapacitation. He controlled the rhythm of the engagement absolutely, dictating every phase of the encounter with the confidence of someone who'd trained for exactly this scenario thousands of times. 3 minutes after the engagement began, exactly as he'd predicted, Security Chief Varlon sealed the section and deployed the sedative gas. By that point, 6 of the 8 Quentara warriors were unconscious, victims of precise strikes to nerve clusters and pressure points. The remaining 2, including Skreth, were beginning to falter, their weapons discarded or disabled, their bodies bearing the evidence of 100 small injuries that added up to overwhelming disadvantage. The old human stood in the center of the corridor, breathing hard but still upright, still ready. He watched as Skreth collapsed to the floor, the sedative gas finally taking effect. The Quentara leader's eyes remained open, filled with something that might have been rage or might have been understanding. I'm sorry, the old human said quietly, though he wasn't sure if Skreth could still hear him. For what I did 20 years ago, for what I was forced to do, you deserved better than me. Then the gas reached him, and he too collapsed, his consciousness fading into darkness. He woke up in a medical bay, his body aching in a dozen places, but nothing permanently damaged. Catherine sat in a chair beside his bed, her expression unreadable. You warned security, she said without preamble. You could have handled them yourself, could have killed them easily, but you warned security and made sure the situation was resolved non-lethally. They were just following their cultural imperatives, the old human said, his voice rough from the sedative. Didn't seem fair to kill them for it. You're a better man than you give yourself credit for, sir. I'm a tired old man who's made a lot of mistakes. Don't confuse that with virtue. Catherine smiled sadly. The Quentara warriors will be detained for a few weeks, then deported back to their home system with stern warnings from the station authorities. Skreth asked to speak with you before they leave. He said he wanted to understand how you moved the way you did, how someone your age could possibly have beaten 8 trained warriors. And what did you tell him? I told him the truth, that you're William Carver, and that's the only explanation that matters. The old human closed his eyes. Tell him if he wants to talk, I'll talk. But after that, I want to disappear again. For real this time. Somewhere even you can't find me. I can't promise that, sir. I know. But you can try. She reached out and squeezed his hand, the way she'd done countless times in the field when words weren't enough. Then she stood and left, giving him the solitude he'd asked for. 2 weeks later, a mining vessel named the Periodic Element departed from Haldron Station. Its manifest listed its crew as a single human pilot, William Carver, heading for the asteroid belt to resume his consulting work. Security Chief Varlin watched it leave on her monitors, her amber eyes thoughtful. "Should we track him?" one of her officers asked. "No," Varlin said quietly. "Let him go. He's earned his peace." The vessel accelerated into the dark, its transponder signal fading as it moved beyond the station's tracking range. Inside, the old human sat at the controls and watched the stars slide past, feeling the weight of decades slowly lifting from his shoulders. He would find a quiet place, he decided. Somewhere small and forgotten, where nobody asked questions and nobody cared about the past. He would live simply, work honestly, and when his time came, he would face it with the same calm acceptance he'd faced everything else. The ghost of Kepler Station faded into myth and memory, became a story told in bars and military academies, a legend that grew with each retelling until the man himself was lost beneath layers of exaggeration and speculation. But somewhere in the vast dark between stars, an old man lived quietly, watching sunrises on worlds that had no names, and remembering that sometimes the greatest strength is knowing when to stop fighting. And that was enough. The end. If you enjoyed this story and want more cinematic sci-fi like this, support the channel. Click the link in my bio to help me keep these stories alive.